Good evening. This is attorney Roy Oppenheim, foreclosure defense attorney and legal blogger. I thank you all for coming this evening, and those of you who are online for joining us. I really appreciate it. We are clearly in unprecedented times right now, and certainly the election over the past 24 hours suggests that there's enormous discontent right now in this country. And what's interesting, I mentioned yesterday, was that the robocallers were calling right before the election, and not only were they annoying a lot of people, but they were disrupting the phone grid throughout the country. And it reminded me how the robo-signers and the signers of the foreclosures for the banks who have committed fraud and perjury, they too have gummed up the system. But instead of gumming up the phone lines, they have gummed up the legal system, they've gummed up our constitutional rights, and they too have done something that is very sinister and has very serious consequences for our society. So tonight we're going to be talking about toxic foreclosures and foreclosure fraud, and why the bank's fraud is turning the real estate market into the Wild West. And literally, I have to tell you, I've been practicing law for 20 some odd years now, 24 years, and typically the real estate law is one of the slowest forms of changing law that you have in the world. And many of the precedents and legal doctrines that we have become accustomed to in the area of real estate law are over 400 years old, and they pre-exist before the United States was even founded, and they came over from England, and before England they came over from Rome. And what we've seen is many of these precedents literally turned on their head, turned inside out, laws changing by the day, to the point where judges have to hand out cheat sheets to themselves, distributing cheat sheets to all the other judges, as well as distributing those cheat sheets to the lawyers that practiced before them. I'd never heard of that before. I've never seen that before. And so we are in very unusual times, I must say. I'm going to tell you some things tonight that you don't want to hear, and so I ask you in advance not to shoot the messenger. We're going to be talking about the implications of the real estate market for the next 10 years and what this foreclosure crisis looms for the next 10 years. Wall Street Journal said big banks told not to fix a fraud. You know, the government kind of talks out of two sides of their mouth. On the one hand, parts of the government is saying this is a very serious problem. Another part of the government says, nah, it's really not a serious problem. We can fix this. It's just some paperwork. If you take away one thing tonight, I will tell you, and I had said this a year ago, and I said this 2 years ago, we're talking about fundamental constitutional rights. We're talking about the U.S. Constitution. We're talking about the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights. We're talking about the foundation of this country. And so some of the issues that we're going to talk about tonight literally are out of the Wild West because they really shouldn't be occurring here in the United States. Which banks should you watch out for? And so to some extent, if you have a mortgage with one of these banks, and if it's particularly a securitized trust, and of course you're not going to know if it's a securitized trust until you get foreclosed, because all you're ever going to see is a name Bank of America, GMAC, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Deutsche Bank. Those may or may not be your lender. They may be your servicer, but typically they are servicing a portfolio of loans on behalf of a securitized trust. And it's usually in those particular situations that there are very, very serious problems with the paper as it has been moved around from one party to the next. And that brings me to Humpty Dumpty. And it's very complicated what Wall Street did. And on one hand, it's very clever, but on the other hand, it's rather sinister. In the old days, the mortgage and note would always stay together, and it would never move or separate. And so if someone took over the note, they would take over the mortgage. But like in Humpty Dumpty, if you consider Humpty Dumpty as an egg, and you consider that the egg is broken in half, and half the egg is the note, and the other half of the egg is the mortgage, and that together the note and the mortgage is the egg. What has literally happened is that Humpty Dumpty's egg has fallen off the wall and has cracked, and it's cracked into a whole bunch of different pieces. The note has been divided into what are called tranches, where different parts of the note have been sold off to different investors all over the world, and the mortgage has moved in a separate course of conduct, and ultimately, it was never envisioned that the mortgage and note would ever have to come back together again, because no one ever anticipated or expected that there would be wholesale foreclosures in the United States. If there was an occasional foreclosure, they would try and figure out how to stitch Humpty Dumpty back together again. But in this particular situation, where you have tens and hundreds and millions of foreclosures that are going on in the United States, there is no system that has been put in place to truly put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And so part of this crisis is that the foreclosure or mortgage industry has attempted to try and figure out how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, how to put the mortgage and note together in the hands of one party, and how to bring the interests of the note holders back together again so they have a right to legally foreclose. And up until now, we have seen a judiciary, for the most part, that did not want to acknowledge that Humpty Dumpty had fallen off the wall. Of course, I would say in the past few weeks, many judges have started to acknowledge that there is a problem, and the only reason they're acknowledging the problem, and let's be quite candid, is because when they pick up their morning newspaper and have a cup of coffee, and on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, on the front page of the New York Times, and in Moody's or Reuters or Forbes, they are talking about this crisis, all of a sudden they can't pretend that they don't understand this problem. And for the longest time, for at least 2 or 3 years, lawyers would be going into court on a regular basis, explaining constitutional legal theories to the judges and telling them that these banks did not have the right to foreclose, and it fell, for the most part, on deaf ears. But that is changing, and we're happy to be part of that change. So who does bank fraud truly affect? It's a very complex web, and we're going to go over each of these groups tonight. Obviously, the first group, and there may be people in the audience here and certainly people at home, that are in foreclosure. And to the extent you are in foreclosure or you're expecting to be in foreclosure, you may have rights that have not been properly asserted as the bank attempts to try and foreclose on you. And if the bank does not have constitutional standing, does not have the right to be in court, they do not have the right to foreclose. And up until now, the courts have routinely ignored that right. They have ignored the fact that the United States has 3 separate parts of our government. We have a judicial, we have a legislative, and we have an executive. And the judicial branch has what's called jurisdiction, the right to impose law upon us as citizens. And that imposition is protected by the Constitution. So when your neighbor wants to sue you, or you want to sue a neighbor, or you want to sue a bank, or a bank wants to sue you, there are certain predicates, certain things that have to happen before the court can acknowledge that they have jurisdiction over the case, and therefore jurisdiction over your property and you as a human being. And for the most part, the judges just have chosen to ignore that part of their responsibility as judges. And in my opinion, at points, have ignored their judicial oath of office. So people in foreclosure, that is one group. Next group this fraud has affected tremendously are investors. We have investors who we've represented for years. They're from many parts of the world. They could be from Israel, they could be from the Arab states, they could be from South America, they could be from Europe, they could be from Canada. And they've always expected that we would have a real property system that was transparent, that was clear, that was understandable, that you could look up who owns your mortgage, that you would know who owns the property, you would know if a mortgage was assigned, who that mortgage was assigned to. And so they expected from us what we have been able to do for the last 120 or some odd years, and that is have one of the best systems of recording property rights in the world. And in fact, it is because of that right and that system that we have been able to generate the massive flows of capital from all over the world, and why America has been the reserve capital all over the world, the American dollar, the U.S. greenback. And so investors right now are starting to think twice again about investing in real estate in the United States. We've seen foreclosure sales come to a crawl. We're seeing less sales coming through. We're seeing less investors who are buying. And the reason they're buying less is because they're concerned about this fraud, and they're concerned about dirty title. People with dirty title. Now, if you have dirty title, that means you've already bought a property, and in fact, it has in it a foreclosure that is probably latent with fraud. And that means that if you bought that property, that the person who was foreclosed may have been illegally foreclosed and therefore may have a right to try and get their property back. So if you're an investor, you're concerned about having dirty title because you're concerned that someone in foreclosure may try and get the property back and hurt your investment. Hopefully you all have followed that so far. Now you have the title insurance industry because they are supposed to protect the investor and protect people with dirty title. And we're going to talk about the title insurance industry because that's where the Wild West is absolutely wild right now. They're supposed to protect the investor who buys title, and then they're supposed to make sure that if there's a problem, they'll pay the investor or the homeowner and then take care of the people who were in foreclosure, who illegally foreclosed, so maybe they'll get some of the money. So that's the title insurance industry, and we'll get back to them in a second. And then you have people with clean homes. In fact, you may end up with two kinds of real estate markets here in the United States. You're going to have people who have clean homes, not clean in the sense that they've vacuumed and shampooed their rugs, but more importantly, that they don't have in their chain of title a dirty title that's latent with fraud from the banks. And so clean home title may in fact have more value ultimately than folks who have dirty title. Now, of course, you'll say there's title insurance, but as we move on, we'll see what the title insurance is going to be doing about this because it's very interesting. But before we proceed, I want you all to look very carefully at a document that is been recorded by the banks that's just blatantly fraudulent. And let me tell you how the fraud busters can figure something like this out. You have a notary here in Florida, and it expires in November 2009. In Florida, if you're a notary, notaries are good for 4 years. So that means that on November 16th, 2005, this notary was good, and before that, that person would have had a different stamp. But this document was clearly backdated to November 10th, 2005, when this person's notary would not have existed. So this document also got recorded in the public records only in 2009 or 2010. It was backdated to 2005, but we all know that the notary didn't exist in 2005 on that date, so we know that this document is fraudulent. And what's interesting is that this document was created because it was trying to prove that the bank had ownership of the property at a certain point in time. And when you can prove that the document is fraudulent, it then means that the bank didn't have standing and that this foreclosure has to be dismissed. There are many other kinds of frauds out there, but I just wanted to show you one. Oh, I got another one here. Here we go. Linda Green. Her name's been all over the paper. The real Linda Green, there's a reward for the real Linda Green because Linda Green has various aliases. She has different signatures depending on her mood, her personality, or if she's signing a document with her right hand, her left foot, or her right foot. In reality, from depositions, we understand that Linda Green's hand would get tired. Sometimes she'd be on vacation. Maybe she wouldn't be available. And so other people would sign for her. And of course, the notaries would swear that all 4 people are Linda Green, and the witnesses would do that too. And for those of you who are watching out there, if you don't know what that's called perjury, and that does carry a crime. That is a crime, and one of the things that judges like to do when they catch people who perjured themselves is throw you in jail. And for my lawyer friends out there, there's a judge in Pinellas County that has now said that if in fact a lawyer is to bring these kinds of documents before his court and is going to continue to effectuate fraud in front of their court, that he will hold those lawyers in contempt and not just ask them to pay a fine, but will incarcerate them. And so this is what we call the Wild West.